It is November 11, 2011, 11 a.m. It is Veterans Day. Across the United States, this day is celebrated by those who enjoy peace and freedom to honor those who give us our peace and freedom through their sacrifice in the military and government service. Since the Revolutionary War, our protectors have been people from all walks of life who have voluntarily and involuntarily defended the United States and upheld this country's way of life. On today's show, you'll hear from a different type of veteran, representing a little-known branch of government service that had its beginnings in 1903, then for the United States Army, came to be known in 1941 as the Special Services. The Special Services were designed to bring morale to the wartime and peacetime troops. They were to provide a recreational balance to the stress of military service both stateside and overseas. In a word, they were supposed to have fun. Dr. Sandra Lockney Davis was, in her words, a Special Services girl. She joined these men and women in 1964 and promptly got assigned to Korea. Fortunately for her, it was a decade after the Korean War. Then unfortunately for her, her assignment 3 years later was Vietnam. And she landed in the middle of that war. In her upcoming book, So What's a Nice Girl Like You Doing in a Place Like This, Dr. Davis gives us an insight into this most unique service through her funny and poignant personal essays. I sat down with Dr. Davis at the National Museum of Naval Aviation to talk about her experiences as a veteran from Seoul to Saigon and how she helped to balance the heavy side of war. I'm Robin Richard, and this is Heard, interviews with authors who have something to say. Dr. Sandra Lockney Davis, it's a pleasure to be here with you and to interview you on Veterans Day, this day that we're celebrating all of the men and women who served in the military and civil service. So it's interesting. Now, I think I need to say this first and get this out of the way. I've already had the pleasure of interviewing your husband, Charlie Davis, who wrote personal essays about growing up in Pensacola. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
My first question is, I want to read a quote to you by Ann Kelsey, who does the intro to your book. And she says, she was a librarian with Special Services, and she says the majority of those who served in Korea and Vietnam were young female college graduates, and it was a life-changing experience for them. So my first question is, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like that?
Thank you for that. I've heard that a million times, but not recently, except for the title of the book. Thank you. Well, it isn't such a remarkable story for me. I was a military dependent all my life, so I lived with the military. Travel was normal for me. Military structure and discipline was normal. My father was an Air Force pilot, the sweetest man you will ever meet or would ever meet, and we traveled. I had 2 younger sisters and a younger brother, and we traveled as a unit all throughout the world. We lived in Europe, and we lived all up and around the United States. Graduated from Arizona State, went to Catholic University outside of DC. So going to Vietnam and to Korea was not such a major jump for me, other than the fact that it was a primitive country in Korea and there was a war going on in Vietnam. That made it different.
Well, that's a little different. I mean, oftentimes as people celebrate Veterans Day, they will see amazing sculptures of mostly men. They will see beautiful pieces of some families, but usually it's the men there alone. So really, I mean, I think the title to your book really is very descriptive of the times that war sees, which is it's mostly men, and a lot of people will then say to a lot of women in the military today, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?
Exactly. I woke up one morning and thought, that's the perfect title, because that's what we women heard every hour, or once a day, if not many times a day. And the nurses would get that, the Army nurses and Marines and the Navy, any female that was overseas would hear that, and it was very sort of an affectionate thing, I think.
You already mentioned that you have two sisters and one brother. What was it like growing up? I mean, you lived everywhere. I think you say that you went to 100,000 schools. Is that an understatement?
No, well, that's a little overstatement. By the time I graduated from high school, I'd been to 24 different schools. That was normal for me. I didn't know any better.
And every time your father would be assigned, and your father was in the military himself, and we'll get a little bit more into about him.
Right.
But then you had to change. You and your siblings had to change.
Right. And so, as I say, I didn't know there was any other way to live. I thought everybody did that. Although, when we moved and I went to a new school, I was always sort of an outsider. But I think I grew accustomed to that. I do remember being anxious several times a year when we had to change schools, so I did experience that. But I was always happy to move on to another place.
So the move for your father's career didn't necessarily correlate with your school ending or beginning. You would move and your sisters would move and your brother would move in the middle? In the middle
of the year. I see now my children and grandchildren, and I see young people who make their decisions based on the school year, and I find that so remarkable because that had nothing to do with our moving when I was growing up. I don't think that my parents had the luxury of deciding when to move. But now I have to tell you, I did not mind moving. I was always happy to go someplace else, even though I was anxious about meeting new people. And I have another sister who was always ready to go. But I have a sister, my youngest sister would say, oh, when are we leaving? She wouldn't even ask where we were going because she liked to travel. But I have a brother and another sister who really suffered because they had to transfer all the time, and they preferred to stay in one place.
What about your mother? It seems like it's aptly divided. You and your one sister like moving as your father did. Did your brother and your sister, did they reflect your mother's views about moving?
Actually not. My mother really enjoyed moving. She always said when my father would tell her, when we retire, he said, I want to go back to West Virginia. And she said, if we go back to West Virginia, you're going by yourself.
Your mother said that.
That's right. She was ready to go. And it was really difficult for her. I admire her greatly. She took it in stride and never thought it was unusual. But she raised us. She had 4 children when my dad was gone most of the time. He was in SAC at that time, Strategic Air Command. He was gone 3 months of every 4.
And he was a U.S. Air Force pilot,
right,
so for those who don't know what that is.
Exactly. So she did all the accounts. She took care of bills. She took care of taking us wherever we had to go. She made sure we were fed and clothed and got to school and was responsible for everything. And yet she just took it in stride.
Did she feel like a single parent, like she was the mother and the
father?
Probably.
I don't remember her ever discussing it. I just look back on it and think, wow, she did everything.
Yeah. So after college, you wanted to travel. And so I can just hear in your mind saying you wanted to join the Foreign Service. I can just hear in your mind saying, I want Buenos Aires, I want the south of France, I want Korea.
Not exactly. Actually, my high school album says my goal was to travel and see the world. And actually, I look back on it about 20 years later and I said, wow, I said that and I really did it. No, Korea was not on my list, nor was Vietnam, but the opportunities arose and I had not been there. So I lived in Europe because I was a dependent. My dad was stationed there. First, I went to Germany as a dependent. Then when I went to work, the first opportunity to travel came up and it was Korea. So I thought, Korea, I've never been there.
That was not your first choice. Your first choice is, or you got an offer from the Department of Commerce fresh out of college.
Right.
And you got an offer early
on. And Department of Commerce, I wouldn't have traveled. It would have been a career job. I could have worked my whole life there, and it would have been a good job. But the lure of, even though it was a temporary position, the lure of traveling to Asia, where I'd never been, the Orient, to see that part of the world was just too much. So I chose that rather than the permanent career.
This was a time, this was in 1964.
Right.
So this was a time when the women's liberation movement was really taken off. I wonder if you can recall, or if you would sort of think back on that time to what your mother was thinking, because here your mother's settled down as such with the 3 children. I almost said 2.3.
Yeah.
with
That's 4.
4 children, with 4 children, and is in this sort of traditional role for women at the time. And then here is this movement. Gloria Steinem comes on the scene. The National Organization of Women comes on the scene. Civil rights is in full throttle. And here you are, young woman, going off to be independent. What do you think your mother thought?
Oh, I know. She wanted to know why I didn't stay home and get married and have children. When I graduated from college in '62, the only options for me were to be a nurse, to be a teacher, or a secretary. Those really were the main options. I considered going to law school, which was way out there at that time, and I might have pursued that, except I really wanted to travel.
You could be an international lawyer, huh?
Well, I didn't want to wait that long, so. But my mother was very traditional, and she wanted to know why I wanted to go travel and didn't want to stay home, get married, and have children. But she supported anything I did.
What about your dad?
My father was not thrilled with my going to Korea or Vietnam. He had been to both places. He'd fought in the war. He'd flown 100 missions in Korea during the Korean War. He had not yet gone to Vietnam. I went to Vietnam before my dad was assigned there. But I say this in the book, that if I had been born a boy, I probably would have been a career officer, a pilot, like my father.
Because it was expected of you, or because that would have been the way that you could have traveled?
That would have been the way I would have wanted it. My father was a remarkable man that was able to guide his children in a wonderful way without being a disciplinarian or without being dictatorial. He would discuss any issue we wanted, as long as we wanted, and all sides of it, encourage us to make a decision. But he did have a subtle way of making sure we made the right decision without our knowing it. So,
which is interesting when you think about military men, at least the stereotypical military male, it's my way or the highway.
Right,
sort of deal. So the hierarchy is very
and
plain.
That was nothing like my father. As a matter of fact, someone I remember not long ago said that their son-in-law was in the military and he was such a sweet man, she couldn't imagine why he wanted to be a killer. And all of a sudden I thought, maybe people don't realize that military men are protectors, not necessarily warriors. And my father was a protector. So it was not the stereotypical disciplinarian, and I think there's several books that were written about the horrors of being a dependent of a military man who ran the family like a military unit. My father was nothing like that. I didn't know anybody that was like that, so I was fortunate.
So you were ready to take a job at Department of Commerce.
Mm-hmm.
This opportunity comes up with the United States Army Special Services.
Right. It didn't really come up. I sought it out. I answered an ad in the DC, one of the DC papers, probably the Washington Post, and of course it was something intriguing like join the special services and see the world. I'm sure they didn't say that, but no, but I'm sure that wasn't exactly that way, but that was the gist of the ad, and that was exactly what I wanted to do. So I responded to the ad, and they were thrilled because the only requirements that were you have a college degree and be willing to travel, and boy, I fit that bill perfectly.
Did it play in the back of your mind that the war was going on? I mean, I know it's not on U.S. soil, but there was a war going on.
Well, there wasn't in '64. When I went to Korea, that was 11 years.
Vietnam.
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah. When I went to Korea, my first job, it was 11 years after the war, and Korea was just trying to recuperate from the war. It was devastated and very primitive. When I went to Vietnam, there was a war, and I knew it very well. I had already worked in Korea for a year. As a matter of fact, I applied to go to Alaska, and the recruiting office in DC called me and said, would you consider going to Vietnam instead of Alaska?
Did they mention the sunny weather or anything like that as opposed
No,
to
because we knew there was a war going on. It was serious. But I had been to I'd already completed a tour in Korea, which was considered a hardship tour, and apparently had done a good job, and they thought that I would be responsible and mature enough to go to the war area. And I thought, I know it's a scary thing, but you know, when you're 24, 25, you don't think you can die. There's just no way.
Or for those military men and women, 18 or 19, and thinking the same thing.
Of course,
Yeah.
it was different in those days because those 19-year-olds and 18-year-olds were drafted. They had to go. That was scary to me. If I had been drafted and had to go, I would have been terrified. But somehow the idea, I was protected because I'd lived with the military all my life and they had protected me, so why would I think any different? Now, my father said, no, that's not necessarily the case because you're going into a war zone and no one is safe in a war zone. But I was the eternal optimist, which I probably am today too, and thought, no, I've never been to a war. It's a patriotic duty. I probably would have volunteered if I'd been a male because of my family history, and so I said, okay.
So, the literature for the U.S. Army Special Services talks about the recreation, the entertainment, the service clubs, and the library.
Right.
What were you expecting when you got there?
I wasn't sure what to expect about the job, but of course I'd lived on military bases all my life, so I knew a military base. I knew what military bases were like in the United States. When I got to Korea, that was not like any military base I'd ever been on. There were dirt roads, gutters, Quonset huts, no shopping, no one movie, a theater with one showing of one film once a day, and maybe a matinee on Sunday.
Of the same movie.
Of the same movie. I mean, there were few choices, no choices. The PXs, the department stores, the PXs, the Post Exchange, had only men's items. There was nothing there for women to buy other than magazines maybe, but very little. So I was surprised, but it wasn't it wasn't that bad. I was so excited about absorbing all of the interesting things, sights and sounds and people. Korea was, I mean, it's like Wonderland in reverse, because you step into this primitive place and you meet all these people that speak a language you couldn't possibly understand and have a
and they don't understand you either,
right.
So you don't speak Korean and they may not speak
exactly English. And the thought process is totally different. That's another interesting thing about
and here you are representing a country that they were embattled with just a few short years earlier.
Of course we supported the South. The South we were there to protect the South, so we were sort of heroes there. I'm sure that the Koreans didn't want to be occupied either, and we weren't an occupying force. We were there to support them and to protect them. So that was different. Vietnam was a totally different experience. We were there to support the South Vietnamese, but they were also tired of having foreigners in their country, and while they wanted our help, it was also a conflict or a struggle between those who wanted us gone because we were foreigners. It's similar to what we're experiencing now today in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've never been an occupying force, but I'd never hear anyone talking about that on the news. We've always been there to support, and we pour money into it. We support orphanages. The military does such wonderful things when they're in a place.
I think probably I can hear people maybe taking an issue with that point, saying that it's probably two sides of the war, the political side and the military side. So it would depend on what side you're on that. I want to get back to what you said about Korea, and I wonder then about the interchange with you mentioned in the book that there were Koreans who were working on the base.
Oh yeah.
And you said that they were friendly. I wonder if you knew that if you knew that because they worked on the base. I know you mentioned a Mr. Lee, and not to make any assumptions here, but if you knew that once they got off the base, that if they were in fact on the side of either the South Koreans or the North Koreans.
By the time I arrived in '64, it was 11 years after the war, and the Koreans that worked on the base camps, they were career civil service. I mean, not U.S. civil service, but that was their career, working for the Americans. We had no difficulty. There were no terrorists in Korea. The Koreans were focused on rebuilding and recovering from the war. The Americans were there to help them do those things. When I was in Daegu, I had a wonderful relationship with the University of Daegu. We invited them on the base to the orchestra, or the School of Music came on and performed for us, and I took a calligraphy class at the university. So there was a lot of exchange, cultural exchange.
Korean.
I did take a course, but it was on the base, and it was through the education office, and it was simply to go shopping downtown. Hello, thank you, goodbye.
What's the best bargain?
Yeah, how much is this? That was sort of thing. And I'm afraid I've forgotten most of it. But that Korea was such an interesting and wonderful place to visit when I was there. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I have a picture of me in the book in the Korean traditional dress, because I made friends with a number of the Koreans and their families. When I came back to the United States and went to Catholic University and for my master's in library science, there were 2 Korean girls in my class. So when I accepted a job again in Korea as a librarian, as my second tour, I visited with them with special services, only this time with the library part of special services. I had 2 friends in Seoul. Both of the young ladies' families, they lived there, and they invited me to Seoul. and they would come and visit me. They showed me where to shop, so it was a wonderful experience.
So your special services, and you take care of the recreation part. It's a two-part question, but I need to get this question off of my nosy chest.
Okay.
How did you pick your guys? Because, I mean, you are one of how many women, and with all of these guys. So I know there are a lot of women going out there going, she just has to pick of the best litter.
I did. In Korea, I was the belle of the ball. I had a wonderful time. The men are, both Korean and Vietnam, were wonderful. We had some very strict rules, and we were very professional. I know that it's hard to believe if you've never been in a situation like that. The men were most respectful. They were so amazed that a young girl, a young woman would come to a place that was so primitive and lacking in amenities and luxuries. So they were just completely befuddled by us in most cases.
And happy to see you.
Oh yes,
well.
very happy to see us. But we were, our rules were, we were never to date enlisted men, because those were the men we worked with. Those were we had the club for the young men who were too young to go to the NCO club or the EM club, which served alcohol.
The
non-commissioned officers.
Club, which is enlisted.
Right. They're the upper echelon of the enlisted. They're in charge of the enlisted. Okay. They run the Army, they run the Air Force, they run, I'm sure, the Marines. They get the work done. But we were not allowed to date those. We were to be professional at all time. Our uniform set us apart in that.
Very snazzy.
Oh,
gloves
yeah.
And
hat, gloves, heels, nylons, always.
In the middle of
Korea.
Primitive place, as you say.
And I have to say those were the rules, but we were able in areas like in Korea. I didn't go to work every day with nylon or with high heels. I wore nylons, but I wore tennis shoes, and in the summer I could wear bare legs and tennis shoes, or a little black flats. We were allowed to do that, and I didn't wear my hat.
Very regimented. Even if you could relax, it was still very regimented.
Yeah, but we were very pleased. The uniform gave us a purpose and a rank and a position. So it wasn't like we ran around with mini skirts and bathing suits or shorts. I don't recall, other than going pheasant hunting, I don't recall in Korea that I ever wore slacks. I think we never wore shorts, and we never wore slacks. We had civilian clothes, but when we wore civilian clothes, we were going to a party, or we were going to dinner, or we were going someplace else, so we didn't wear pants. You could, I think slacks were acceptable, but I don't remember ever wearing them. But the uniform protected us. It said, we are here for a mission, we have a job to do.
It's not just a party.
Right, exactly. And it worked, and it was wonderful. The officers were always very respectful, mostly always respectful. I can't say, and I wish I could describe in words what a wonderful experience it was, in that the men were so appreciative, whether they were officers or enlisted. They were just very appreciative of us.
Describe a day. You wake up, you put on your nylons, and you do what?
Put on my uniform. If I'm early enough, I walk over to the mess hall, which probably the closest mess hall is an officer's mess, have breakfast, then walk over to the service club. You walked everywhere because there were no vehicles other than military vehicles. Opened up the service club. Usually, in both cases, we either had an enlisted man assigned to us, or we had a Korean assigned to us, a Korean staff. So they would be there early to open the doors and start cleaning the floors and things.
These were the civil service, Korean civil service people.
Right, and they weren't technically civil service, but they were a cadre of employees that were career, and they were very appreciative of having the job with the American military. But my day would be to appear, and they would already have the coffee pot going, and they would be cleaning and polishing and getting ready for the day's activities, and I would go to my office and make sure I had assembled all of the materials I needed for the evening program. I had monthly reports to do. I had requisitions for either supplies or work orders to maintain the building. My job was basically program director for a service club until I was also acting club director, and as a club director you managed the place. You had to make sure that the roof didn't leak, or you got somebody to fix it, and the toilets weren't stopped up and somebody was there to fix it. You had to make sure you had enough coffee to serve coffee call. And
what did when the enlisted men would come in, what would they do once they got to the service club?
Well, it was a wonderful thing. The Army does.
It sounds fun.
Yeah, it is a fun place.
Even after war, this sounds fun.
The service club was a fun place to go. The Army did a wonderful job, as did the Air Force and the other services. They purchased instruments, musical instruments, very expensive, with amplifiers. They had guitars with amplifiers, drum sets. We had trombones, trumpets. Nobody used those much, but the guitars and the drums were mostly the most popular. They could come in and come to what we called a checkout desk that had board games, cards, anything like that they could sit and do. They had stationery, they could write home and letters. We had, they would come and check it out and then go to a music room, and they could form a band or they could play themselves. We had a ping pong room, a pool room. They could check out or sign up to play. We offered tournaments and then gave prizes. So the day would be making sure we had all of those things in place so that when the soldier came in, he had access to all of it and we didn't run out of anything.
And all of this was just to make sure that they were not bored. So I suspect that it was a lot of downtime. I mean, yes, you had to work and you had to rebuild a country and you had to protect the U.S. interests.
In Korea, the Army was mostly on a regular schedule, 7 to 4, whatever, but it wasn't a stateside assignment. You still were on duty 24 hours a day if you were in the military. However, you did have more downtime or off-duty time in Korea than in Vietnam. You were never off. You were always on duty. But in Korea, there were hours from, say, 4 or 5 in the afternoon. There was a movie at 7. You go to the mess hall at 6, the movie was at 7, and then it was over. The service,
the same movie.
Yeah, right. The service club was open usually until 10 o'clock, and you could come in. We had a program every evening at 8 o'clock, and we had either a quiz show where the men could answer questions and win prizes, or we had tournaments scheduled. The programming was anything you could think of that you think they would be interested in. It was a very creative job, but you had to be well prepared because you couldn't run out to Walmart and buy supplies. We had to plan months in advance because in those days it took weeks to get things from the United States, sometimes months before, and we had to order through the Sears catalog. Wow. That was the big thing, Sears Roebuck. Oh, absolutely. That was my Bible for a while.
We'll be right back with more Vietnam War stories from the National Museum of Naval Aviation with Dr. Sandra Lockney Davis and her new book, So What's a Nice Girl Like You Doing in a Place Like This? Today's show is brought to you by First Friday Mobile, the iPhone app that lets you explore, discover, build, and connect your kind of cultural places. Get this First Friday Mobile app and discover the thousands of places you could have already been. And Five Sisters Blues Cafe, where great food and great music meet great friends. Five Sisters Blues Cafe, serving Southern flavors and soulful music in the heart of Pensacola. I'm back now with Dr. Sandra Lockney Davis, a civilian veteran who served in Korea and Vietnam as part of the Army Special Services. still at the Naval Aviation Museum, we move now to the Vietnam hangar, which is an amazing place, and it has amazing artifacts and stories of the men and women who served. When you transitioned from Korea to Vietnam, were the activities pretty much the same?
I would say technically we did the same programming, but somehow it was very different. Men who came to the service club in Vietnam were tired and hot and sweaty and exhausted, and the living day to day, hour to hour was so intense, and everyone was exhausted.
And simply because the Vietnam War was going on.
Exactly. You lived every day with an intensity, either trying to forget where you were or to keep busy, or dreading, for example, mortar attacks always occurred at night. And so the Viet Cong and the NVA, of course, wanted to disrupt
the North Vietnamese
Army. They were the trained forces, the guerrilla forces were the Viet Cong, and their efforts were directed at keeping you on the edge and keeping you exhausted. And so while their aim with the mortars and the rockets most of the time was not very good, it kept you awake. You had to run to a bunker. So we had men that would come to the service club who needed to rest and to distract themselves. We had magazines. They could come in and actually sit down in a relatively comfortable chair and read a magazine, which they had no place else to do that.
So unlike Korea, where the enemy was boredom
mostly
in Vietnam the enemy was a physical person, and so they were they were happy to have peace and quiet, to have that sort of sense of boredom.
Exactly. I'm sure it's been described many times, because it sounds very familiar to me, that Vietnam was long periods of boredom interspersed with moments of terror, and that was exhausting. Wow. So, and I wasn't in a combat area. I always feel a little guilty talking about being uncomfortable or the intensity or being tired in Vietnam, because I wasn't out in the field. I didn't go out in the jungle and stay for days and be wet all the time and have the bugs eat me up. And I mean, we had no air conditioning. We had tropical buildings, which the walls were screened with slats on the outside, so the wind and the sand would blow through. But my condition was nothing, and not nearly nowhere to compare to the danger of the combat soldier.
But just as important for the support side, because you do have to have, I suppose, never having been in war, I would suppose that you do have to have a sense of balance, even in this war and this war-torn area. Yeah. That both your mind, your body, and your spirit, or all three, your mind, your body, and your spirit, need that sort of balance as much as you can get it. So I would suspect Absolutely. That not speaking for all of the special services, but I would suspect that the men and women there really appreciated a book in a chair and 10 minutes of quiet, as opposed to mortar attack, or not even knowing if you're going to wake up the next morning.
And just talking to an American girl, by the way, we were known as round eyes. Now, some people will say, oh, I wouldn't say that, it sounds derogatory, but it was a very affectionate term. We considered it an affectionate term.
And you were called that by other Americans, so that it wasn't a cultural thing.
The American GI called us round eyes. So
that's why I'm laughing, because I think I get it, that it's a term of endearment.
It was, and we called them GIs and our guys. We were Special Services girls. There were Red Cross girls, also known as Donut Dollies.
I love that. And why were they called? I'm getting hungry all over again.
It's my understanding, and I'm not an expert at the history, but I understand that the Red Cross started their recreation program back in World War II, and in maybe World War I, and they actually had a donut machine that made donuts. So they served every morning. They would go out and make donuts and serve coffee and donuts to the troops, and they would go around to various sites.
Which I would guess would give them a sense of home. What sort of things did you do with the Army to give the GIs a sense of home?
Actually, our physical presence. We were a sister, a mother in some cases, a girlfriend. We reminded them of home and why they were there. Our very presence was that kind of reminder, as were the Red Cross girls. And their mission was to go out to the sites while we were managing facilities in the rear echelon areas, rather than, although I did get to visit men in the field, that wasn't my primary job, as was the Red Cross girls.
One of the things you always hear about is the food or the lack of flavor thereof. You had a kitchen. Did you do anything?
We didn't. In the club.
In the club, yeah. So did you do anything that made the men feel at home there?
Yeah. Now, I have to say, mess hall food was really good. You had different flavors depending upon your chef, whoever was the mess sergeant. But in the service club, we did not cook meals, but we used our kitchen for programming, and two of the favorite things were the men liked to make their own cookies, so we would have a cookie baking night. They also liked to make pizza, which we would do that. We did those kinds of programming more in Korea than we did in Vietnam. In Vietnam it was hot, there was no air conditioning. We didn't really have kitchens in the service clubs in Vietnam, so we would have things made. At one point in Vietnam, I tell the story that I had to do a survey to find out what the men wanted for their coffee call on Sunday morning. We thought, well, we'll ask them. They wanted toast with butter and jelly. Well, odd as it sounds, we didn't have any toasters, and there was nowhere to buy a toaster.
So things we take for granted.
Exactly. So my job was to do the survey, find out what they wanted, and then to figure out how to get it for them. So I ordered toasters from Sears, and then I had to find some place that would bake us bread.
And you had to do this months in advance, because this was not, you couldn't run down to Walmart. I guess it would have been Sterling or TG&Y then. You couldn't run down to the local store.
Right, there was no place to go to find things. You couldn't buy things unless it was a Vietnamese product. You couldn't buy it on the economy. Although there was a big black market that you could get things that they sold in the black market, but toasters usually were among those. So I ordered those, and then I had to find somebody to bake the bread. You couldn't go buy a loaf of bread anywhere either. The mess halls did wonderful baking, but they baked for their menus, and like cinnamon rolls, donuts, they would make at the mess hall. And donuts and cinnamon rolls, when they make them at the mess hall, are very sturdy foodstuffs.
Oh, they
last a long time, and they're very heavy, which makes them delicious. But I think the guys wanted something light, and so the toast was the big thing. So I had to find a bakery that would specifically bake us loaves of bread for Sunday morning, and then I had to arrange transportation with the military to get a Jeep to meet me in the morning, to take me to pick up the bread, then take it back to the service club and cut it and toast it, and be ready for the coffee call that started at 8 o'clock. So
I'll never complain about, seriously, I will never complain about having to run to the store again.
Well, we wouldn't. It was just something that was part of it. But this is a little example of the things that we take for granted, or we don't think about as being, and the things I mention in my book that you never think of.
And I suspect that that's probably, we've come a little ways in the 40 years since the end of the war, but I suspect that probably those men and women who are in Iraq and Afghanistan still have that sort of, and serving overseas too, if you're in a remote area, that you still miss those simple
I would imagine
things.
that it's a lot better, but there probably are a number of things that we don't think of that they are doing
they
without.
Take for granted. You must have met a lot of fabulous people from all walks of life.
Robin, they were so many wonderful people, and then there were some jerks too. But the wonderful
kind of balance out, right?
Well, they're not nearly as many jerks as there were wonderful people, and the American GI is definitely my hero and was then. And there are several nice stories that I remember that stuck with me. That's the reason I put them in the book. In Korea, I remember a young sergeant who helped us at the service club and was depressed one day, and come to find out his wife and new baby, they had a car accident, and he needed some money because she didn't have a car to take the baby to the hospital or to the doctor. And so instantly I said, well, how much do you need? And he said $100, as if it were above and beyond any sum, and I just wrote him a check for $100 and gave it to him. Well, my club director, and we were briefed before we go over, you never date enlisted, you never loan money, you never go into a restricted area, and always have orders and everything. So my club director, after she heard the story, smiled and said, you can kiss that $100 goodbye. Now, my club director is Kay Strasberg Bardsley, and she lives in Oregon, and I have to tell you that Kay is a wonderful woman. She's also great because she read all my Korea stories and gave me feedback.
And she was a rule follower.
Well, not necessarily, but she knew how to make things work and gauge them so that they fit in somehow. She didn't circumvent them, but she knew the important thing to Kay was to get the job done and get it done right. So she was a great teacher. But the young man, I worried about that because I thought maybe the service club had lost a friend and I had lost a friend because he wouldn't pay it back. But 2 weeks later, he comes marching in the club, hands me a $100 bill and said, what's the program tonight? I could have hugged him, but I didn't.
And his wife and child were okay.
They were all right, yeah. So he was grateful that I did that. Of course, I never loaned money again, but then nobody ever asked me, so I don't know whether I would have.
You had a few nights in shining armors, too.
Oh, yes. Well, and I had a lot of other stories about the GIs. One of my chapters is entitled Profile of the American GI, My Hero. So I have several stories. And I have a chapter on my knights in shining armor, who were the young men that were my romantic interests, or vice versa. Most cases, everywhere I went, I'd have to have a friend. It's an unusual situation, and you almost have to read the book to understand the circumstances, that we were the center of attention. We were scrutinized. We lived in a fishbowl. We couldn't pay more attention to one than another. We also were very aware of rank. We had the ranking officers at any given event demanded our time first. Then if there was time, we could meet and talk to the lower ranking officers or the lower ranking servicemen. So it was a hierarchical thing, but you understood the rules and you knew how to manage. And it wasn't a thing where, oh, I'm going to be rebellious and do something different.
Yeah.
It was important to be safe and to keep the men safe. One of the problems we had was there were commanding officers who felt that we were more a liability than an asset.
Simply because you were women, or
we
because
were women,
you were
we were civilians.
So both.
Both. And that it was their job and it was extra work on their part to protect us. So we were not...
From the men who were jerks.
Or the war. We were in combat areas. Well, we were always in a combat area, so it was that we were a liability. And we found that mostly in Vietnam because we were new there. In Korea it was established. But in Vietnam, we would run across a commander who would not support us. It was never overt, it was mostly covertly. And we might not get supplies when we needed them, or somebody might forget to include us in some vital information.
Do you think that it was this sort of, and I hear you saying that, yes, it's in a war, but do you think it was a sort of gender bias or a misunderstanding about your role to the armed conflict?
Well, it could have been both, but basically when you have a non-combatant in your command, you're responsible for them, whether it's a newspaper journalist, whether it's a recreation leader.
But that's the same
if you had well, there were men who were cooks. There were women and men who were medical people.
But they were trained soldiers. They were all those were all military people. So only the civilians were non-combatants.
Meaning you didn't get any training whatsoever.
We were not allowed to carry weapons, so we were totally helpless except for the command. But I have to say that was very rare for us not to have support. Mostly we had tremendous support from the military, from the commanding officers. I have a few incidents which I can document, and sometimes it's amusing and sometimes it's not, from those times that we were not supported in the way we thought we should be.
And matter of fact, you were, I guess for lack of a better word, you were attacked by, maybe too harsh, but you were almost attacked. But the fear is still the same.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a chapter entitled Almost My Worst Nightmare, and in that I recount, while I was in Vietnam, I was alone while the club director had to leave to deliver some documents, and a young man broke into the quarters, and I was sound asleep, and of course nobody would believe this, and all I can say is the good Lord was looking after both of us when I woke up and took him by the arm and said, you know, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. If anybody finds you here, you're going to have to leave. And
he was near you or near your bed?
Oh, yeah. He was kissing my elbow when I woke up, which was pretty... It was a good thing I was exhausted, because I kind of still felt like I was at the service club, so it was not that ever happened at the service club. And then, of course, I have another chapter that's, I think, one of my favorites about mortar attacks and me. One of my friends, I have to tell you, Ann Kelsey wrote the foreword to my book. I think you mentioned her earlier. She writes...
She was a librarian.
She was a librarian in Vietnam, and she's made some wonderful comments about her experience that I've included in the book. I have to tell you, Robin, the book is a collaboration of a number of people that I'm so grateful to.
And the photographs are stunning. I mean, they give real life. So that as you're talking about this, it's not just words, that you could really see the people who you were interacting with, and I find that fascinating.
Oh, and the photographs, some of them are not good quality because they're over 40 years old, and I finally got a little spy camera which was about this big and took 16 millimeter slides that don't even exist today.
But you get the sense of the area, even the quality notwithstanding. Yeah.
But I do have some excellent quality films from Judy and Harry Purcell, who live right here in Pensacola. Judy and Harry were stationed in Korea at the same time I was, although we don't remember meeting. And they met and married. They fell in love, and when they came back to the States, they got married, and they are still happily married today.
And she was a special services.
She was a recreation director at a nearby base camp. I can't believe we didn't meet, but I think we sort of passed. I was transferred to another area, and she was transferred down. But we've met and we've become friends, and they've been very helpful. Judy read some of my Korean chapters and gave me some feedback on them. And
the authentic Chekhov.
Yeah. And Carol Law here in town was with USO, and she read some of my Vietnam chapters because she was in Vietnam, and said thanks for the trip back to the past. There are certainly other people that I want to mention. Before we end, I would like to mention that not only Ann Kelsey, but Ricky Cole was my supervisor, Kay Strasberg was my supervisor. Both of them read some of my book. I have people who contributed, Kathleen Cordova in California, Renee Capullo from Virginia, Ann Kelsey and Judy Jenkins Galdino in New York, and Nancy Grove in Florida.
This is like the war, huh? It's a collaboration.
It is, and I want them all to know how grateful I am for their help. And I think that with this interview, they'll be watching this all over the United States.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for the interview.
That's the benefit. Well, from all Americans all over the world, we say it to our military folks all the time, and there are folks like you in civil service who we need to thank as well for really being a veteran and supporting those who are in the military. Thank you for that. That's all the time for our show. We want to wish all of our veterans a very special Veterans Day, the 93rd celebration of the Veterans Day after the end of World War I. The conversation continues online at HeardTV.com and on Heard Radio. We hope you enjoy your family on this day. Now go read a book.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Our last word comes from a 22-year military veteran who is also a military father. Meet United States Air Force retired Master Sergeant Ronald Dagley, who served with the Armed Forces Radio and Television units. We salute Master Sergeant Dagley and the men and women who pass the military traditions on to their sons and daughters so that peace and freedom remain allies.
Well, first of all, Veterans Day today means a great deal to me because it should be more than one Veterans Day, but since it's this Veterans Day, it means a great deal because it reflects on all the sacrifices that our men and women have undertook to make this country free. So it's a very personal thing for me, and it's a great thing to see not only the military family notarizing the fact that Veterans Day is Veterans Day, but also the whole country as a whole now looks at this. I mean, businesses and everything are finally using it not as a business tool, but to say and to give back, saying to our fighting men and women that, hey, we respect what you do, and we want to continue to do it, and you got our support. So Veterans Day actually is supporting our men and women, if not just for one day, and letting them know that we're there for you 100%. And on a special note, my daughter is also active duty. I have two active duty people in my family. My oldest son is a Master Sergeant in the United States Air Force, and he's stationed in Shreveport, Louisiana, Barksdale Air Force Base. My daughter, as you can plainly see, is a Navy active duty personnel. And unique thing about Veterans Day is her birthday is also November 11th. So I have a dual purpose with Veterans Day. My oldest son, he's getting very close to retirement. So I think he's been in for about almost 18 and 19 years. So he's in that retirement stage, but he knows he may decide to stay. And my daughter, she's a newbie, so she's only been going on 2 years, I believe. So it's really, I'm very proud of both of them, and I will support them as well as any men and women in uniform today. I take my hat off to you.